Good morning and welcome to the Niskanen Center webinar, High Road, High Performance, a vision for faster, fairer growth. My name is Jerry Taylor. I'm the president and co-founder of the Niskanen Center, and I want to welcome you to our program this morning. Let me start by giving you a little bit of context to where this report came from. When the Niskanen Center was founded 6 years ago, though it of course seems a lifetime ago, not that the engagement hasn't been fun, but 6 years under the past political circumstances have indeed taken their toll. But when we founded the Niskanen Center, one of the animating considerations that we had that we thought brought something new and fresh to politics is the idea that the conflict dimensions upon which the left and the right fought their battles struck us as somewhat dogmatic and ill-considered. So for instance, I came from a climate background, and the idea that acknowledging the reality of climate change and acting to address it is somehow hostile to free market capitalism struck me as insane. The problem with climate change is we didn't have prices which were correct, and we need accurate price signals to produce economic efficiency. And it's the lack of those accurate price signals when it comes to fossil fuels and other emissions which cause climate change, which was harming the economy. So it was an artificial distinction. And we found this again and again wherever we looked in public policy. When we talk about the free market and creative destruction and the wealth creating effects of market dynamism, the right will embrace these sorts of narratives and the left will look at them skeptical. But similarly, when we talk about social insurance and other things that markets can't provide or provide very well at all, the right shrugs its shoulders. It seems to us, however, that if you look around the world, you find that social insurance and market rulemaking is perfectly consistent with well-functioning free markets. This is an artificial conflict. The left and the right need not go to war over matters like this. When the right concerns themselves with social cohesion, which is a legitimate and important consideration, it looks at pluralism and diversity as an enemy of social cohesion. But on the other hand, it struck us as any large society has to have a lubricant of tolerance for those who are not exactly like us for any social cohesion to occur. Otherwise, it's simply a war of all against all. So social cohesion and diversity and pluralism are not at odds with one another. Actually, they're complementary. And we saw this again and again through so many different political dynamics. And so 2 years ago, Brink Lindsey, who is on the call with us today, and Sam Hammond, along with our colleagues Steve Tellis and Will Wilkinson, published a paper called The Center Can Hold, Public Policy for an Age of Extremes, in which they stitched that narrative together and gave it great force. That caused a good fair bit of positive response. But it occurred to us that a vision at 30,000 feet and a theoretical narrative is all well and good to set the table, but what we need is something more concrete to give policymakers guidance. And that's what brings us to our paper today, a vision for faster, fairer growth. This was an attempt by Brink Lindsey and my colleague Samuel Hammond to flesh out what exactly that synthesis looks like in a very concrete fashion, to give policymakers a blueprint for how to go forward in the next Congress. So that gives you an idea of how we got here. It was a two-year project, but we're very proud of what came from it, and we're glad that you're here to share some of our thoughts about that this morning. So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague Geoffrey Kabaservice. He's our Director of Political Affairs here at the Niskanen Center. He'll be facilitating the discussion this morning. He's the author of several books, including most pertinent to our conversation this morning, a book in 2012 published by Oxford University Press called Rule and Ruin, The Downfall of Moderation and the Destruction of the Republican Party from Eisenhower to the Tea Party. And to give special resonance to that book, if you look over my shoulder, you'll find a campaign poster for Nelson Rockefeller from 1968. So without further ado, Geoffrey, take it from here.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Appreciate it. Thank you very much to everyone who is with us today. And thanks as well to Brink and Sam for having created such a great and actually exciting policy paper. I think it's pretty rare in the think tank world that you actually would say that a white paper is exciting. But this is because really it's your attempt to take stock of our present extremely unsettled political, socioeconomic moment, and then try to prescribe some path forward toward progress as we understand it. So before we get into the meat of this paper, I'm somebody who always liked a biographical approach when it came to analyzing historical documents. And so for that reason, I wonder if you could just tell the audience something about how you came to this place, something about your ideological background and the intellectual and political journey that has brought you to this moment in November 2020, 5 days out from the elections. Brink, you want to go ahead?
Sure. My professional background is I'm a recovering lawyer. My ideological background is I'm a recovering libertarian. In the 80s and 90s, I was a lawyer working on international trade issues from a on the free trade side of things. That was in congruence with my my libertarian thinking. I then ended up moving from legal career to the think tank world, where I worked at the Cato Institute for more than 20 years, first heading their trade policy department, and then later being a vice president there. For all of my time for most of my time at Cato, I was a kind of Hayekian classical liberal, so not a radical libertarian that's an anarchist or a night watchman state type, but still someone who believed that government, including on the spending side, was way overextended in American life and was in general looking to cut the government to minimize the government footprint wherever I could. The events of the 21st century have led me to reconsider a lot of my earlier animus against a more expansive role of government. Irving Kristol famously defined neoconservatives as a liberal that was mugged by reality. So I don't know what my correct label is, but I feel like a libertarian who got mugged by the 21st century. And I have come to see that my initial libertarian attraction to the dynamism and creativity of unplanned, spontaneous market activity, that has stayed with me. What I have come to realize, though, is that a thriving free market order is neither self-executing nor self-sustaining, that it works only in the context of appropriate cultural and political institutions that support it, and that enable the largest number of people to thrive within it. And likewise, as far as self-sustaining is concerned, it is constantly in danger of corruption. The Achilles heel of capitalism is capitalists. As Adam Smith noted, whenever two or three are gathered together, their conversation turns to fixing prices and dividing markets. So capitalists have a natural hostility towards competition. They seek to express that hostility in the policymaking process so that they can create monopolies and cartels for themselves. So capitalism is constantly under assault from within by insiders who want to rig the game. And it is my sense, and Sam's and my sense, that the game of American capitalism has gotten pretty badly rigged, and that's one of the major things we focus on in this paper.
And in your capacity as vice president at Niskanen, you are in fact working to unrig what Smith called that conspiracy against the public.
Yeah, so my last book was with Steve Tellis, a senior fellow at Niskanen, although when we wrote the book, I was at Cato. And it's called The Captured Economy.
Subtitled, How the Powerful Enrich Themselves, Slow Down Growth, and Increase Inequality.
Yeah, so all about regulatory capture and rent seeking, and what a big pervasive problem it is in 21st century America.
Great. And actually, I would highly advise everyone to go to the Niskanen website and look at Brink's 3-part essay on what the pandemic implied for libertarian beliefs, which is well worth looking at.
Yeah,
And that's also where you can
that essay
find.
is a, spells out a good deal of changing of my thought over time, and how the libertarian free market side had its moment, but it's increasingly out of sync with the challenges that the country is facing today.
Thanks, Brink. And the Niskanen website is also where you can see this report, Faster Growth, Fairer Growth, which is, like I said, a fantastic read for one and all.
One more plug before you go to Sam.
Sure.
On Captured Economy. Don't forget capturedeconomy.com, our website about all things rent seeking and regulatory capture.
Quite right. Now we turn to Samuel Hammond, Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at Niskanen. Sam, how did you come to be here?
Well, I know I wasn't doing anything in the 1980s, unlike Brink. I was a twinkle in my mother's eye, but I think like a lot of libertarians / former libertarians, it's something that you fall into as a teenager, become increasingly when that idealistic phase where the simplicity and sort of system style thinking of a lot of libertarian and free market writing is very appealing. And it was certainly appealing to me. I think my instinct was always a small L liberal, that freedom, liberty, toleration are all sort of foundational values. But the way libertarians take that is to sort of reify those concepts and make them very almost absolutist. And as I moved away from that prior sort of idealism, part of the impetus was having a greater appreciation of history and understanding how the liberal project, so to speak, is always sort of embedded in institutions and in a historical process of development. And it's not just something like a architectural blueprint that is completely idealized. And when it comes to this paper, in many ways, every topic we talk about could be construed as, for example, fixing the unemployment insurance system, something very technical and prosaic. But on the other hand, all these line items kind of combine to form a new kind of social compact or social contract or democratic settlement. And I think that the idea is also rooted in a very liberal concept, which is that pluralism and toleration for each other and the social contract just don't happen by accident. Our rights may be unalienable, but they don't just emerge on their own. They're not self-executing. And recent history and recent trends, certainly to me, feel like a lot of that social contract is beginning to break down and create opportunities for a new democratic settlement. And so rather than sort of tilt at windmills about the idealistic or utopian free society that that attracted me in my youth, I think we have to sort of deal with the art of the possible, but also recognize that liberalism was never about those utopian ideals. It was always about finding peace and settlement between warring factions.
Thanks, Sam. Rub it in, don't you, that you weren't around in the 1980s. We'll there. Brink, let me ask you this question first, and then turn to Sam with this. What are the problems that you looked at in society, in the economy, in the situation that confronts us, that kind of led you to your particular focus in this vision paper?
Yeah, so this is a policy agenda, not about everything, not a cure, not a complete response to all the problems that ail America, but a focus on one particular big problem, which is the kind of economic malaise that the American economy has been experiencing throughout the 21st century. And that is a double whammy of slow growth and high inequality. So growth as measured by annual growth in GDP, real inflation adjusted GDP per capita. The growth rate in the 21st century has been just a little bit better than half of the average growth rate in the 20th century. Meanwhile, that growth is highly skewed. So in terms of the income is skewed these days heavily towards people at the top. So a sluggish growth rate still overstates the economic curve for families in the middle or in the bottom half of American society. In addition to this income polarization, we've had class polarization along educational lines, geographical polarization, where more and more of the dynamism of the economy is concentrated in a few superstar coastal cities. And so this kind of breakdown of dynamism and the polarization of well-being have both been sort of deep structural problems in the American economy and frankly in many advanced economies, and I believe are an important contributor to our political polarization and our political dysfunction that we're experiencing today. The paper is addressed at the fundamental problem of the lack of inclusive prosperity, that the economy is sputtering relative to how it did in yesteryear, and that the benefits that it does deliver are delivered much less equally than they had been in yesteryear. And so that appreciating that problem leads us fairly seamlessly to our heterodox ideological positioning, which is to see the need simultaneously for much more market dynamism and creative destruction and much more robust provision of social insurance and public goods.
Thanks, Brink. And that certainly was the genesis of this paper, in a sense, your Center Can Hold paper that you and Sam co-wrote with Steve Tellis and Will Wilkinson.
Yeah, and just on a note on that, I see this paper as a kind of missing link between that statement of principles in the Center Can Hold and the day-to-day policy work that the Niskanen Center does. We have policy departments that are actively engaged on Capitol Hill and with the executive branch in the weeds on specific matters of legislation and rulemaking in immigration, in climate policy, and in poverty and welfare. So we're small. There's a whole lot of things that we think are important that we don't currently work on. This paper moves down from the sort of clouds of general principles from the Center Can Hold, but still is a much broader look than the specific policy work that we currently have resources to do, to look at a wider range of issues that we see pertinent to the current challenges we're facing.
Thanks, Brink. Sam, how would you articulate the way you looked at the problems that led to what you discussed in terms of the policy vision in the paper?
Yeah, so the first chapter is called A New Policy Synthesis, and the concept of a synthesis is, I think, runs throughout the paper, where some moderates or some centrists split the difference. They are the Howard Schultz type moderate middle, so to speak, which really represents maybe 5% of the population. In reality, our form of moderation is one in which we see the best of the left and the best of the right as not antagonistic, but actually forming a more coherent whole. And the other sort of animating theme throughout the paper is that connects with synthesis is this idea that the quality of our markets, the efficiency of our markets, whether they're captured by rent seekers and corruption, and the quality of our government, whether it's able to sort of act efficiently in the event of a pandemic, to get new vaccines developed, or to ensure that emergency relief gets at the door. Problems in one sort of affect problems in the other, and in some ways, declining state capacity, or the declining capacity of our federal government to do much at all, and the accretion of regulatory capture on the private sector are sort of part of a common phenomena, in my view. They are both really institutions, and both sets of institutions, both the public and the private sector, undergo a process of decay if they're not continually invested in. And we've radically underinvested in both through a mix of intentionality and just complacency.
Brink, participants on the call who are not economists or who have not read The Captured Economy might not be familiar with these terms rent-seeking and regulatory capture. since they are so much at the heart of the captured economy. Can you just give a brief layperson's explanation?
Yeah, rent seeking is a terrible economist jargon, which means seeking excess profits through the political process. So there's two ways to prosper in a capitalist economy. One, you can build a better mousetrap, or two, you can build more favorable rules that favor you at the expense of everybody else. And so it's option two, which is the bad kind of entrepreneurial activity, political entrepreneurship, narrow interest, leading to regulatory capture. Regulatory capture means when the rules are being dominated by one narrow set of interests who then rig the rules so that they favor that group at the expense of the general welfare.
Thanks, Brink. Sam, the report is, as I said, called Faster Growth, Fairer Growth, but it's also subtitled Policies for a High Road, High Performance Economy. Can you kind of distinguish what you mean by this high road, low road approach to economic performance?
Yeah, absolutely. So the concept comes from labor markets. You can think of sort of two paths or two strategies for how to treat your workers. One is to treat them as entirely disposable, and another is to treat them as assets in which you invest, in which you try to build skills into, and try to maximize their human capital. What road you go down is not sort of predetermined, right? There are different sort of rules and structures to the labor market and to our institutional setup more broadly that lead you down one path or another. So I think the most famous sort of case study in the US context is the disparity between, or the divergence between, the North and the South of the United States following the Civil War. So, slavery was the sort of ultimate low road strategy insofar as, it's not just low wages, it's no wages. And to some extent that depressed investment and productivity growth in the South, because why use, machinery when you have humans as your robots? And that was that if you think about the sort of what is the legacy of slavery in that context, it was a kind of low wage political economy that has persisted to this day, where many southern states are, 2/3 as wealthy as the northern states, and have very high inequality because of very low wage service sector employment and so on. So, one of the chapters on economic development policy is making the case that this isn't a fait accompli. We can drive a lot of catch-up growth, not just in the South but across the country, to put workers on a high road path where they are no longer where our economy is no longer sort of increasingly divided between these high wage, high salary knowledge jobs and kind of precariat service sector jobs, that we have a robust pathway to a middle class existence that reflects the sort of diversity of human talents and aptitudes.
Yeah, so in the labor market context, the low road strategy is you don't provide any training to your workers, and you expect high turnover. So workers are costs. In the high road strategy, workers are seen as assets. You invest in them, you invest in their training, and you work to keep them longer term so that investment will pay off over time. So I think there's a space in the economy for low road employment for people who want to, who want a rather casual attachment to their employment. But in the political context, we see we lean very heavily in the direction of seeing all of our citizens as assets rather than as costs to be minimized. And so this idea of a high road captures our commitment to robust provision of social insurance and market enabling public goods. We see that investment as necessary to get market activity working at its highest level. Combining that idea of the high road with high performance, I think, is an attempt to reflect our left-right synthesis. The high road talking about government spending as an investment sounds very progressive. That's a regular progressive talking point is to talk about all government spending as investment. Of course, some government spending is a very bad investment. The idea of high performance is that it's not enough just to have these good intentions. You actually have to, the investments actually have to be well thought and well executed. So we combine the progressive recognition of the need for activist government with the libertarian recognition that even well-intended government activities frequently go south. And so in particular, we see government activism as vulnerable to capture by insiders and to what our colleague Steve Tellis has called kludgeocracy, just the sort of accretion of unintended consequences as rules pile up on top of each other and authority becomes ever less clear cut. So our idea is to have activist government, but with a recognition of how it can go wrong and design that activism in a way to minimize the chances of dysfunction.
Right. Two quick other points. Much has been written about median wage stagnation over the last 40 years. And that's a very important topic, and we definitely talk about that as well. But the median kind of betrays what's going on underneath, because it's not just that median wages have stagnated, it's also this phenomena of job polarization, which we dive into in the paper, where more than the inequality of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk having billions of dollars, there's been this tendency for the labor market to bifurcate, and so-called middle skill jobs have eroded and have been replaced by a kind of two-tiered labor market of low skill and high skill jobs. And that's a form of inequality that is very in your face. If you've been to San Francisco recently and you walk around, it's unhoused people alongside software engineers earning $300,000 and baristas that are commuting in from an hour away in North Oakland. And that is the form of inequality that is not just in your face, but also I think very destabilizing to the legitimacy of capitalism, right? To the extent that people do not feel like they have a way into the mainstream of the economy, that is incredibly alienating.
Yeah, one of the things I like so much about this paper is that it reminds me of Paul Collier's book on the future of capitalism, in the sense that it also proceeds from this diagnosis that capitalism is not working as it has in the past. It is not lifting a broad segment of the population up to prosperity. You actually have generations where children expect to do worse than their parents, which has not really been the story of the last century for the most part. And then to that general broad policy vision, you actually put specific policy recommendations. And I went through last night, as you know, and counted up more than 50 of them. But these fall into three broad, areas of policy analysis. The first being supporting workers and protecting families. The second being liberating the captured economy. And the third being reviving innovation and dynamism. And Sam, since it's more or less your department at Niskanen, can you just give us an overview of some of the ideas as well as a few of the specific policies in that first section on supporting workers and protecting families?
Yeah, well, we began this effort back in December, January, before the pandemic hit, but a lot of these themes have really come to be extra relevant, especially the chapter on social insurance modernization. So, during March and April, every Thursday, the jobs report would come out and there'd be another million people losing their job and entering unemployment. State unemployment offices across the country had their websites crashing. There were lineups around the block, during the apex of a pandemic, people waiting to, file their claim and potentially receive, the bare minimum benefit that they could receive, where, it's barely enough to probably pay their mortgage, let alone make up for their loss of health insurance. And so this really brought to the forefront the need both for a sort of more substantive social insurance system and unemployment insurance system that genuinely gives people a cushion, but also the whole architecture, the technical architecture in the background that doesn't get a lot of attention because frankly, it's a little boring. The fact that the typical unemployment insurance system at the state level is running on COBOL programming from the Kennedy administration is pretty depressing. But it's also the sort of thing that doesn't really get addressed until a crisis like this hits. And you start to realize how bad it is to have systems written in programming languages that like 100 people in the country are available to help fix. That chapter begins by walking through sort of a timeline of what happened this year, where circa January, Taco Bell was posting advertisements for 6-figure positions to be managers of a Taco Bell, $100,000 to work at a Taco Bell. That was a product of one of the tightest labor markets in recent history, driven by one of the longest expansions on record, and it just disappeared overnight. And the first half of that chapter is talking about both how to fix the systems at the architectural level and also how to use those systems towards getting us back to full employment.
So an essential, again, the idea of the high road is that that all of us are assets. We all are potential contributors to our shared well-being, and so we need to make the investments necessary to bring those assets to bear on our common prosperity. So one implication of that is that full employment is a very good thing, and chronic high or relatively high unemployment and the waste of human resources, the waste of talent, the waste of lives that entails is a very, very bad thing. In the wake of the great inflation of the 1970s, we succeeded in conquering that problem, and then have been fighting the last war pretty much ever since. So that on a macroeconomic basis, we've had much more frequent periods of slack in the labor market than in the past. And our social insurance system, as Sam mentions, remains patchwork and has become increasingly conditionalized and even punitive. It's everything is going in the wrong direction. We see a monetary policy committed to keeping slack out of the economy, committed truly to the dual mandate of price stability and full employment, along with upgrading and modernizing the social insurance system as all of a piece to put us on that high road, to put workers first, and to thereby maximize the good for all of us that happens when we're working in a humming, thriving, hot labor market.
Brink, the first section is on essentially taking the high road economically. The latter two sections are more about high performance. Can you just walk us through what might practically be accomplished to have a less captured economy? What are some of the ideas that you come up with in the second section?
Yeah, so we address just to hit the scale of the problem. We address sort of three huge malinvestments in the American economy. One, the doubling of the size of the financial sector over the past 30 or 40 years relative to the economy, with very little to show for it except some spectacular hedge fund fortunes and a global financial apocalypse. Secondly, the healthcare spending at 18% of GDP, where in other rich countries it averages around 10%. So nearly double the share of the economy devoted to healthcare spending in our country, with, again, very little to show for it. Significantly lower life expectancy than many other countries, and our life expectancy has actually been falling in recent years. And then finally, artificially produced shortage in housing in those cities where the demand for housing is at its highest. At the same time, we've had this economic polarization where all of the dynamism and opportunity in America is increasingly concentrated in big coastal cities. Those big coastal cities have been building moats around themselves in the form of increasingly restrictive land use regulation that makes it very difficult to build new housing, and therefore puts very high upward pressure on housing prices, and therefore prices non-college educated workers out of the housing market of these big coastal cities. A normal egalitarian dynamic of markets, which is a kind of arbitrage of incomes across regions where people will move from poorer places to richer places, thereby reducing the income differences between them, a pattern that we saw throughout all of American history until quite recently. That has broken down, and now we're seeing this geographic polarization caused by land use restrictions, which again is producing a huge boon for one group of insiders, namely incumbent homeowners, but lost opportunities and lost GDP for all the rest of us. So these are big problems, and we see in the case of the financial sector really a pattern of sort of systemic subsidies where the whole regulatory system is set up to on the assumption that financial institutions will be
I think Brink froze there for a second. So Sam, I'll take this opportunity then to ask you. We don't have Niskanen a taxation
very
or
highly
housing
leveraged, that is, if they will.
Unfortunately, but we do have a section that looks at climate change, a section that looks at immigration. The last section really sort of speaks more to what Niskanen is doing right now. Can you just kind of walk us through some of the ideas that we have for reviving innovation and dynamism?
Sure. So it's not just the, as Brink was talking about, all the areas of regulatory capture Brink just mentioned. If you think about it, finance, intellectual property, land use, these are also some of the most intangible sectors of the economy. That intangibility actually probably helps make them vulnerable to capture, because when you're generating enormous profits at a hedge fund, and you can't really point to what the thing is that you're making, there's an opacity there, and so the final chapter on innovation and dynamism is, if you think about it paired with the previous chapter, it's also about shifting our economy away from the intangible back to the tangible, to actually build things again, to build infrastructure, to build new technologies, to massively invest in science and R&D, but also to reform the way we do science and R&D. So the typical scientist doesn't spend 40% of their time filling out grant applications, which is the current status quo. And importantly, promote diversified economic development. So, going back to sort of simplistic, idealistic, free market sort of models of the world, the classic one from the free trade perspective is Ricardian comparative advantage. If you're good at making wool and the other country's good at making wine, I specialize in wool, they specialize in wine, we trade. That is true to that is a very real force and dynamic and an important one, but it also suggests that when countries are sort of on autopilot, they can become over specialized. And part of the diagnosis in this chapter is to say, the U.S. has walked down a path where we became hyper specialized in a certain type of knowledge work produced by a certain type of college educated worker, and that narrow specialization has left out the broader diversity of human talent.
Thanks, Sam. I know that you guys thought about these subjects from what I would call a nonpartisan or even a transpartisan perspective. But nonetheless, this doesn't feel like an ivory tower exercise. This feels like good ideas that would directly address real problems we're facing right now. I wonder how you think that either party might receive some of these ideas depending on the election's outcome in 5 days. Brink, you want to just take a stab at that?
On the capture economy stuff, regulatory capture, those issues just completely cut across partisan lines. That it's much more about particular constituencies versus versus everyone else, rather than cleaving along ideological lines. So you'll see on intellectual property issues, you'll see the people who are defenders of the status quo, from liberal progressives and conservative Republicans, and questioners of the status quo, again, across the mix. Likewise on land use. So that's an area where I think it's quite clearly the case that depending on the issue, you're going to have odd bedfellows coalitions of Republicans and Democrats to try to get something positive accomplished. On the dynamism innovation, that's a mixed bag. So some of the issues like reforming environmental review, which we see as a major obstacle to building anything in the United States, that's going to be received sort of more favorably right off the bat by the right than by the left, although people on the left are coming around to recognizing the problem. Whereas investing a lot in more public R&D and building technology hubs and technology diffusion centers and the like is going to challenge or free market laissez-faire priors on the right. So it's again, we look at the problems that face America and try to come up with the best solutions without a lot of attention to whose ox is getting gored or what constituency is going to warm to this. But that's fine, because there's two sides, and so we will have opportunities to progress sometimes on one set of issues and another time on another set of issues. I think on the social insurance modernization front, there's going to be big opportunities if we have a Democratic administration and a Democratic Congress coming in 2020.
Thanks, Brink. Sam, you've worked quite directly with a lot of fairly powerful actors on Capitol Hill. What do you think would be favorably received by people from both parties in terms of what you've laid out here?
Well, part of the issue selection process, so take the child allowance. A child allowance is an issue I've worked on for 4 years now. And one of the reasons I work on it is not just because providing direct support to parents would potentially slash child poverty in half, but also it's a particular policy that has resonance among both conservatives and progressives. So progressives would approach it from an anti-poverty perspective or even a racial equity perspective, whereas the right is more likely to approach it from a pro-family perspective, where we invest in households and children and family stability as a good in itself, sort of a whole life agenda. And so going back to the concept of synthesis, one of the reasons we lean into that concept is not just because it's good on its merits, but also because there are ways we can appeal to the interests of both left and right. And that is important in and of itself, given the extent to which our politics has polarized and is sort of tearing the country apart, right? A lot of my work on the Hill has been with Republicans, and that's primarily because the last, let's say 15 years or so, with the Tea Party insurgency, there has been this sort of anti-government attitude on the right, and it has led to a kind of atrophying of the muscle of statecraft, where there are a segment of Republicans and conservatives who are kind of fed up with the obstructionist point of view and the austerity point of view, and want to actually do things, want to actually legislate and craft policies that are proactive about everything from the opioid epidemic to our collapsing fertility rate. And the issue is they don't know how to do it, right? That seems kind of shocking, but when you look at congressional staff, they're very time and budget constrained, and that's the role of think tanks in some part, to go to the Catos or the Heritage Foundations and say, well, we want to solve this problem. Can you help us? Give us some ideas. And if everyone you turn to, the main idea is don't do anything, then eventually you hit a wall. And so, one of the longer term goals of my work is also to provide a off ramp for people on the center right who are kind of fed up with that anti-government attitude and want to use the government to achieve their own ends, not the same ends as progressives, but to recognize that there is a legitimate role for government in the country to solve actual problems.
What Sam's been talking about illustrates the difference between our transpartisan moderate approach against that sort of conventional bipartisan centrist approach. The bipartisan centrist approach takes the existing policy priorities of the left and of the right and tries to meet somewhere in the middle. What we do is take the values and priorities at a higher level of abstraction of the left and the right and come up with new policies that advance those values simultaneously. So in the case of a child allowance, again, it's addressing the anti-poverty and racial equity concerns of the left and the pro-family commitments of the right. In particular, on the right, you can sell child allowances as a relatively non-social engineering alternative to universal daycare, where the state has decided the best way to raise your children is put a lot of money out there, as opposed to just empowering parents to raise children the best way they know how. So this idea of coming up with policies that can be where both sides hold their nose and eat in the middle, but where progressives can advocate them full-throatedly for progressive reasons, conservatives can advocate them full-throatedly for conservative reasons. That's the sweet spot we're looking for.
Or take another area like science innovation. It's hard to, AOC and Mike Lee probably can agree that science innovation are good things. And even some of the most anti-statist libertarians recognize a role for government in providing sort of pre-competitive R&D and funding of basic research. But the problem is, over time, just like many of our institutions, there has been a kind of decay and complacency in how we fund science. Not only has our spending on R&D fallen by 30% or so as a share of the economy, but it's shifted into an incredibly bureaucratic sort of equilibrium, where, as I mentioned previously, 40% of scientists and academics' time is spent doing compliance on grants and rather than doing actual science. And so one of the proposals that we endorse in this paper is called the Endless Frontier Act, and it includes it encompasses a massive increase in funding for the National Science Foundation, but also via a new directorate that's designed to sort of break the logjam in science and provide scientists with a great deal more flexibility and the program officers and what they fund, and to take actual risks, because so much of sort of the grant process in science is about making very incremental, safe forms of bets. And that's something that the act itself was originally sponsored by Chuck Schumer and Todd Young, so it's bipartisan, and it's also driven in sort of recognition that with the rise of China and with other global threats, including non-state actors like the pandemic itself, there is a total nonpartisan interest in not just increasing funding for science, but to get more bang for our buck. So in our view, it's much more productive to work on those areas of agreement rather than to always be leaning into the areas of disagreement.
Thanks, Sam. As our colleague Kodiak Hill Davis pointed out in the chat, obstructionism is not ultimately a viable governing approach, and I'm glad you're providing an off-ramp for some of these Republicans. I'd encourage audience members to submit questions. And we've got one from Misha Chellam. This one's directed toward Brink. Misha writes, I read The Captured Economy and found it very compelling, but the solutions chapters seemed a bit thin. At the core, it seems like narrow interests prey on our institutions. What are some concrete proposals to tilt the field toward the general interest?
So I think always every policy book, the What Is to Be Done chapter is the weak read. Because it's a lot easier to identify problems than it is to actually identify compelling pathways to solutions. But in the captured economy, we don't just kind of come up with a checklist of here's how policy has gone wrong and here's how we would like to see policy changed. Instead, we look at how the policy making process is vulnerable to capture, and we address ways in which policy making the process can be altered to steal it against being overwhelmed by greedy insiders. So for one thing, we think a big increase in and professionalization of congressional staff is an important response to regulatory capture. And again, this is very counterintuitive from a free market right perspective, that more government spending could actually save you a lot of money. But the fact is that legislators are always going to be in an information asymmetry relationship with the industries they seek to regulate. That is, the regulated industries know more about what's going on than the people writing the rules. And so that means the people writing the rules need really top-notch staff help so that they can sort out the facts from the self-serving spin coming from those regulated industries. Alas, Congress, even as the scope of government regulatory activity has exploded since the 1970s, staff has been in decline, and we're still stuck in the sort of old Andy Jackson patronage system of yore when it comes to congressional staff. It's frequently 20-somethings who are children or of donors. And they just, that's not a system that puts legislators on an equal playing field with the people they're seeking to regulate, and it's very easy for them to get rolled. So likewise, increasing the information gathering and analytical powers of the executive branch, not just at the federal level, but particularly at the state level, where a lot of regulatory capture occurs, would be good. Also, just moving the locus of policymaking. Regulatory capture thrives in the shadows, in obscure venues that are only accessible by highly motivated insiders. So land use is a perfect example. Zoning decisions are made hyper locally, often on a lot by lot basis, and the only people who participate in those decisions are the immediate neighbors, who are the people who have logical interests hostile to new development. They don't want the congestion, they don't want the disruption in their lives. It's not a problem that they have those interests. The problem is that those interests are so massively overrepresented in the policymaking process. So what we need to do is move decision-making up, move it away from the hyper-local to at least citywide, and preferably up to the state level, where a wide array of interests, including in urban growth and creation of jobs and opportunities for everyone, those can be taken into account as well. So there are these kind of meta policy changes that I think are essential to tackling regulatory capture, but it's never easy. The reason, if you look at policies that are really, really terrible and make no sense from a public interest perspective, and they've been there for a long time, that means they're there for a reason. It means very powerful interests are profiting from them, and they're defending them tenaciously. Really, the first step is recognizing the problem and turning your guns towards the people who are driving the dysfunction, and that takes some courage, and we hope that we can help to inspire some.
You know, the Niskanen Center's namesake, Bill Niskanen, was in the Reagan administration, but he was also a famous public choice economist, and public choice is the sort of subset of economics that looks at regulatory capture, the kind of incentives for bureaucracies to grow and grow and grow. And the other thing that was unique about Bill was he was willing to follow the evidence, and where at one point in time the view was we just cut government cut taxes and spending will follow. That was the starve the beast theory, and Niskanen wrote a excellent sort of empirical refutation of that, saying no, if you just cut taxes, spending will not follow. In fact, in some cases, spending might increase. And so we come at this in his legacy as applying a very a political economy forward perspective, where we want to understand, we don't want to use that public choice critique of government as just an excuse to do nothing and to say that government will inevitably fail, but use it as a framework for thinking about under what conditions is government most likely to succeed, and under what conditions is capture kind of inevitable. So in the case of, we mentioned the big social insurance programs, big social insurance programs like a universal child allowance, that's on budget. It's very visible. Everyone gets it. It's cash. That's a difficult thing to gain. One of the byproducts of America's historical resistance to those big sort of social insurance programs is we end up getting a lot of sort of second and third best policies through the tax code, through financial systems, through the proliferation of very ad hoc programs, and that is the realm where capture is almost inevitable. So we take the critique, but then we want to use it to inform better policy design rather than to indict the concept of policy in the first place.
Thanks, Sam. Kennedy O'Dell raises the interesting question of what role does immigration have in a high-road, high-performance economy? And do you have any feelings about Matthew Iglesias's proposals that he puts forth in his recent book, 1 Billion Americans, which, as Jerry Taylor notes, was the subject of our colleague Will Wilkinson's Model Citizen podcast a few weeks ago, and we'll also have you guys on for what I thought was a great discussion. So do you have any feelings about immigration and the Iglesias book?
So there's a subsection in the dynamism and innovation part of the paper on immigration. So if you're serious about boosting, flagging growth and dynamism, pretty much the easiest thing you can do, pretty much the lowest hanging fruit, is to allow liberal immigration, especially of high skill immigrants. So first, there's just a mechanical relationship. More labor inputs equals more GDP outputs. So more people equals more GDP. But when you get to actual GDP per capita and innovation, also immigrants are disproportionately entrepreneurial. They're disproportionately founders of the biggest and most dynamic companies in our tech age. And also population growth we're increasingly coming to see deeply tied in with productivity growth, that a growing population just gives incentives to innovation that a stagnant aging population does not. So we see immigration as a vital component of a well-functioning economy. So I'll let Sam continue.
I don't have much to add to that. I mean, as a Canadian, I favor much higher immigration.
Thanks. This is the last question, I'm afraid, that we have time for in this session. But Andrew Hyman asks, what is your thought about how to implement these solutions in our current political environment? It seems like no matter who wins the election, any major reform will be stymied by the opposition running an obstructionist playbook, which did pay dividends for Republicans in 2010 to 2016. And if the Democrats win both houses and the presidency, wouldn't the compromise be between the center left and center and far left, rather than the left and the right? Do you have about a minute answer apiece, Brink, Sam?
So in the likely in the outlook for Biden administration, Democratic Congress, there's a big chunks of our agenda that are saleable there, and likewise, we know that always, with very, very few exceptions, major legislative changes have heavy input from both parties. And so again, even if we have a Democratic dominated political scene, they're going to need Republican votes to get over the line. And there's a lot of these issues where we think we can attract Republican support. So Sam, with his active work on Capitol Hill, has great experience working with people on the very socially conservative right, the very populist right, and on the very progressive left, frequently on the very same issue. So we know it can be done, and I can let Sam talk a little bit about that in the remaining minutes. But I think we're going into 2021 recognizing post-pandemic, or in the middle of the pandemic, that our state capacity has degraded badly, and there is a big need for investment in that. That is very central to the spirit of this paper. So I see our paper is very much in the zeitgeist of where big structural change may be likely to occur next year.
Yeah, earlier this year, during the primary, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez famously said that she didn't belong in the same party as Joe Biden. And there's a certain truth to that. Lee Drutman, the political scientist, has pointed out that if you really map the ideology of the parties, it's more like there's 4 parties in American politics. And the center left and the far left are forced to be under one tent, and the center right and the far right are forced to be under one tent. And our colleague Steve Tellis has this essay called "The Futurist Faction," where the basic premise is that for the last 20 years, there's been a degree of party discipline driven by the consolidation of political power under congressional leadership, and that is very aberrant in American history and might be coming to an end, in part because these internal divisions within the parties are kind of festering. Like if you look at the relief bill negotiations right now, one of the reasons they stalled out is because Mitch McConnell couldn't get his entire caucus to agree. A big chunk of them didn't want to do another relief bill, but there were a substantial minority of Republican members in the Senate wanted to do something. And I firmly believe that if Biden wins, and even if Democrats take back the Senate, that the era of very tight party discipline obstruction is grinding to an end. And there are going to be opportunities to try to bridge those disparate factions in both parties if people are willing to work across the aisle, and if there are places like the Niskanen Center that are working at the interface of those two to bridge those and broker those connections rather than to merely stoke polarization further.
Well, thank you so much, Sam and Brink, for a great discussion. And thank you to all the audience who attended. I wish we could carry this discussion on for another hour, but we have come to the end of our allotted time. So thanks again for everyone for attending. And please do look up the Faster Growth, Fairer Growth paper at our website, which is niskanencenter.org. It's our featured analysis there. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good one.